It's a bright but wintry morning in the Middle East. A group of Palestinian men and a few children are picking their way around a scene of destruction. Shattered glass, broken poles, and sheets of crumpled, corrugated metal. They stand in middle of it all, pointing and surveying the ruins of their neighbourhood. Above them, a smouldering hole in the side of a building reveals what must have been somebody's home. The tables and chairs are now covered in dust, glass, and shards of broken concrete. This was the immediate aftermath of an Israeli raid on the 26th of January on the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. At least 9 Palestinians were killed. 7 had been identified by the Israeli forces as militants. 1 was an old woman. But in this part of the world, one tragedy inevitably begets another. The following night, on the Shabbos, a Palestinian attacker killed 7 Israelis outside a synagogue in East Jerusalem. And then, last week, Israeli soldiers killed at least 5 Palestinian fighters near Jericho in the occupied West Bank. And then on Friday, a Palestinian drove into a group of people outside an Israeli settlement, killing 2, including a 6-year-old, before being shot dead himself by the police. This lethal escalation brings the total number of Palestinians killed so far this year to at least 40, and the number of Israelis killed to 9. It's the deadliest start to a year in a decade and a half. Back in the Jenin refugee camp, a young Palestinian boy runs cheerfully around his house. Baby Jawad is named after his grandfather, Jawad Bawakna, who was one of the Palestinians killed by Israeli forces this year. One of Jawad's aunts explains proudly that baby Jawad's first word was katibe.
His first word was katibe.
What is katibe?
Katibe Jenin. It's like a youth resistance. It's their nickname, the resistance fighter.
Right.
Katibe, the youth resistance fighters. For the children who grow up here, without hope, surrounded by violence, rage and revenge, what kind of future awaits them? You're listening to Stories of Our Times from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Manveen Rana. Today, the West Bank children who dream of martyrdom.
My name is Josh Glancy. I am special correspondent for The Sunday Times and get dispatched to everywhere from Ipswich to Jenin on special missions, I suppose.
And you've just been on one of those to Jenin, to the West Bank. Tell us a bit about that. Why were you there?
Well, there's been an uptick in violence in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine in recent months.
Today was the deadliest day in the occupied West Bank in 2 decades. Israeli forces raided Jenin this morning and killed 9 people.
In the south, 2 rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip. Israel replied with airstrikes on the territory.
A Palestinian gunman killed at least 7 people outside a synagogue in East Jerusalem today, a day after Israeli forces killed 9 Palestinians in a raid on the West Bank city of Jenin.
I went basically to go to the West Bank and to Jerusalem and other parts of the country and really get a proper sense of how things are at the moment. It feels like we are slipping into one of the darker periods from this region. So I really wanted to go and speak to people in different parts of the country, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, get a proper sense of how people were feeling.
In order to find out what was brewing. Just tell us a bit about some of the people you met.
Well, perhaps the most symbolic place for Palestinian resistance to Israel inside the West Bank is the refugee camp in Jenin. Now, Israel has raided the camp a couple of times in recent weeks, killing several militants, and there have also been some civilian deaths as well. It is really a cauldron of hate and resistance towards Israel, and a lot of militancy and indeed terrorism has come from there. So I wanted to go to the camp and see how people were feeling. I've never been there before. I wanted to see what it was like, honestly, and get a sense of how they view the future and what they think should come next. It's a strange thing because you have Jenin, the town, and then you have the refugee camp, and they're right next to each other. The town is fairly poor, not a very prosperous place, and there are symbols of resistance and martyrdom around, but it's a relatively normal down at heel Middle Eastern town, I would say. The camp is a slightly different proposition. I say camp, it is a place with permanent structures and buildings. It's not tents by the side of the road, but it is a place with its own identity, and there's about 10 or 11,000 people living there, and it really is, as I said, a hotbed of resistance. And so you walk around there and you can see everywhere there's posters of martyrs, of fallen militants, past and present. You know, every time someone falls, a new poster will go up. Every house where a person has fallen will have, posters plastered all over the doors and the cars. You go to a toy shop, and next to the Barbies and the teddy bears are necklaces of fallen soldiers, fallen martyrs, fallen fighters. It is a place really consumed with a sense of death and a sense of vengeance. I must say I was visiting there in the aftermath of 2 Israeli incursions, so emotions were even more heightened than usual, but it really is an extremely angry place in a lot of ways.
And Josh, when you talk about martyrs and posters of martyrs, I mean, what exactly do you mean?
Well, to be a martyr is to have died in the cause of fighting Israel in this context. It's quite an Islamic concept. So if you talk to Palestinian Christians, a lot of them don't necessarily use the same kind of language around this. But there is a sense that you will be rewarded in heaven for a death in that cause. Obviously, a lot of different religions have martyrdom. Christianity and Judaism have martyrdom too. But it is really a kind of central feature of places like the Jenin refugee camp. The martyr in Palestine, there will often be money paid to their family. They will be celebrated and honoured for their sacrifice. I went into the house of mourning of Jawad Bawakna, who was a teacher who was shot, a 57-year-old teacher who was shot during an Israeli incursion on the 19th of January. And it was a house of mourning. So 3 of his daughters welcomed me into the house of mourning. They were all dressed in black, and I didn't quite find what I expected there.
Tell me about that. I mean, how did it feel walking in, knowing, it sounds very somber, knowing it's a house of mourning?
Yes, and the first thing I did was offer my condolences, and then it was explained to me that actually they're not really looking for condolences. In fact, they were asking for congratulations.
Congratulations?
Yes, because their father had been martyred, and for them, they see being upbeat or celebrating these deaths as a form of resistance. So they see misery as a form of giving in to Israeli occupation. So this was very hard for me to get my head around, if I'm honest. Okay, well, can you just start by saying thank you for having me into the home? I was being quite sort of somber and almost ponderously somber, and they were laughing and joking. That's not to say that they didn't feel sad or upset about what had happened. I'm sure they did. 2 of the sisters had witnessed the death, but it was a kind of deliberate choice almost to make light of it as a point of resistance, which I found very strange. It was like the world turned upside down almost.
Yeah. And what did they say to you?
Well, I was asking them about their father, and they said he was a teacher, a sports teacher in the camp, were very widely liked.
He was full of life. He used to walk every day. Yeah, he was a feminist and
كان ترضحوك كتير.
He ran the marching band. He loved to watch Barcelona Football Club at night to relax.
Everybody loves him because he taught the young people in the camp sports in their schools, and his death affected a lot of young people too because they knew him. They used to hang around him because he was fun to be around. He used to always laugh.
They showed me lots of videos of him playing with his grandson, and the grandson was running around. He was also called Jawad, so he had the same name. And it was very sweet. There was a lot of pathos. But then I was talking to the grandson and they said, he spoke his first word recently.
Word was katibe,
which is a reference to the resistance fighters in Jenin. So, and they were saying this as a point of pride, but it made me very sad, really, because you just thought, well, that's his first word. He's going to grow up in this environment. And I said, what do you want for Jawad? What kind of future do you want for him? They said, well, we will educate him, we will teach him to hope, but we have to be realistic about where he is and how he's growing up and what the forces around him are and what the likely outcome of that will be.
What does that mean? What do they see for his future?
Well, I mean, they didn't spell it out, but some form of, they some form of martyrdom is it's not something that everyone necessarily wants or is aiming towards, but it's something that they expect may well come to them.
Everybody inevitably joins the resistance.
I think almost they feel like there's no choice because it's the way they see it, it's being done to them. And actually, I said, how do you feel in the aftermath of your father's death? They said, well, this is how they put it to me, we don't feel that different to before.
شعور الغضب لابد من وجوده سواء كان أبوي شهيد أو ما كان أبوي شهيد. الغضب اتجاه الاحتلال إشي حتمي موجود يعني.
She's saying it's ultimate anger of feeling all the time. It doesn't matter now or before her father was killed because there's occupation and the feeling for it. It's الظلم موجه سواء إلي أو لغيري وراح يضل موجه طالما موجود الاحتلال.
His death came because of the occupation, and the occupation was there before and the occupation is there now. So that's what really is the ever-present, and that was how they framed it to me.
They see, grief would be giving in. Do they talk about what they do want? Do they talk about revenge?
Yes, I mean, I asked Jawad's daughter, Ala, does she want revenge? Does she want to see payback? And she said yes. She said that the synagogue attack in Neve Yaakov, and that happened a few days after Jawad's death, she said it felt soothing. It felt like a form of revenge, not just for them, but for all the Palestinian people.
It felt soothing because it was a kind of revenge, but it was for all the Palestinians.
Yeah.
It was for Palestine. It wasn't for her father.
Right.
Only. It was for all the Americans.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think I probably don't want to take up too much of their time. These are sentiments that I found very difficult to hear because it's hard to imagine the slaughter of 7 civilians being soothing, but that is the depth of antagonism and the mindset that is in place.
Is that how most people there feel? I mean, tell us a bit about some of the other people you met.
I don't think any of them expressed particularly contrasting sentiments. I mean, I met a young man called Mahmoud Tawalbe, 17. He was helping out at the social club. Seemed like a nice young man. And, I asked him about his future, and he said he didn't really think he had one. He sort of, again, kind of expected that some form of resistance and martyrdom was really the only path on offer for him. Mahmoud Tawalbe's uncle was also called Mahmoud Tawalbe. He was a very prominent fighter and terrorist. And it was pointed out immediately to me that he was named after this revered fighter. You can imagine the weight that puts on a young man's shoulders. I mean, everyone will know someone. If it's not in your direct family, it'll be a cousin or a friend or a schoolmate. And, you know, I approached one young man in the street. I knew nothing about him. I just approached him with a translator and asked him if he'd chat to us. He said, yeah, I'll talk to you. And I said, oh, how did the incursions, how have they affected you? He said, well, my brother was killed and he was just smoking and looking at us very blankly in the street. And then he said, actually, I can't talk to you. Not because he wouldn't, he just couldn't. You don't have to look very hard to find people who are affected. So, you know, there are significant economic roadblocks, educational roadblocks to these young people. But there is also a culture that is very focused on fighting, resistance, revenge, and martyrdom.
Just give us a sense of the history of this camp.
So 1948, you have a wave of refugees as a result of the war between Israel and the Palestinians and various other Arab countries.
So they've just been displaced by the fighting?
Well, by the fighting, I mean, again, this is highly contested historical territory, but there was a move by some in Israel to try and push Palestinians out of what became Israel. There were also lots of other factors at play, and it was a war. People do often up sticks and leave during a war.
So was this refugee camp sort of built initially as a temporary measure? Was there a sense that they'd be going home?
Yes, and the question people often ask you is, well, that was 75 years ago. So why are they still there? Why are they still being classed as refugees? Why is it still called a camp? Again, the answer to that is very highly contested. They will tell you because Israel wants us here to be miserable. It eventually wants to just push us out entirely. Others will tell you actually that it has been useful to the Palestinian cause to have these people there because there is this idea of the right of return, that one day people will be able to go back to Haifa and to Jaffa and to reclaim the land that they view as taken from them. So in some ways they are orphans of the history. Jenin in 2002, as some people will remember, was the site of what became known as the Battle of Jenin, and it was a pretty major Israeli incursion at the height of the Second Interfada, and tanks rolled into the town, and there was a lot of fighting, over 50 Palestinians killed and over 20 Israeli soldiers killed as well, which is unusual. What's interesting now is that you have this younger generation, people like Mahmoud Tawabe, who I met, who is named after someone who died in that battle, but doesn't remember it, was born after it happened. But yeah, it is this sense of, it is a massive symbol for everyone in the area, really.
And just remind us about the Intifadas.
The Intifada really just means uprising. There's been 2 Intifadas thus far. The first one started in 1987. There was a lot of rock throwing, tyre burning, protest, riot, demonstration. It got very heated, very violent. Israel responded pretty strongly, and there was a lot of fighting, a lot of clashes, and it went on for several years. And then in 2000, you have the second Intifada breaks out, and there was an outbreak of violence then. And this was when I was a teenager, and I remember it really well because there was this wave of suicide bombings in Israel. Pizza parlors, on buses, at nightclubs, 10, 20, 30 people dying in these big suicide bombings. And then obviously the response, you had things like the incursion into Jenin. You had Israeli tanks surrounding Ramallah, the Palestinian capital of the West Bank. And there was a lot of damage done. I mean, a lot of people died, but also it changed both societies permanently. The left in Israel, which up until that point had been a very strong political force, it was founded as a left-wing country, which had been pushing this idea of we will give land for peace, we will find a 2-state settlement. That idea really lost its currency during the Second Intifada. So we are still in some ways living in the world that the Second Intifada wrought. And I suppose part of the concern now, part of the reason I went to the Middle East was because there are suggestions at the moment that this current violence we're seeing might lead us to a third Intifada.